a slave trader. He had been involved in a lot of different ventures, but he was captured in the act of landing slaves. He was tried, convicted, and much to his shock, he thought he was going to be acquitted. He was sentenced to death. And this is the Harper's Weekly coverage of his hanging, his execution there. He's there in the middle, dangling from the rope. So we have increased naval cooperation in the 1860s. And of course, as a consequence of the Civil War and the many years of hard work of black and white abolitionists in the United States, Congress would move toward passing new constitutional amendments which would end slavery once and for all in the United States. This, of course, was preceded by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which only referred to areas that were in rebellion. It only referred to areas that were not yet occupied by the Union Army. But in 1865, Congress would pass the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery outright. And then in the 14th Amendment, passing several years later, Congress would write an amendment. It would be written in a very vague way, but essentially what it said was persons born in the United States could not be abridged of citizenship because of race or previous condition of servitude. So essentially this was extending citizenship to people of African descent, so long as they were born in the United States. And the 15th Amendment would establish universal manhood suffrage, saying that the right to vote could not be abridged on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude. So I'll leave on that note in which the power of the federal government is strengthened and the human rights of persons trump those of commercial and economic interests of slaveholders. So thank you very much for coming out. Bob.
Who were the slave traders? Can you characterize them? Were they large stock-owned companies? Were they individual entrepreneurs? Were they southern-based or northern-based? And were arguments about free trade prevalent among them?
In the 19th century, after 1808, I presume you were talking about that period. They were. Many of them were, many of the crews were Spanish involved in the slave trade. There weren't necessarily a lot of Americans. There were definitely some who were involved. They were usually backed by some type of merchant firm. They got their backing by some merchant firm who didn't establish a paper trail of their involvement, but they obviously had to have some type of financial backing from some type of merchant firm, a commissioned merchant firm. Many of them, they were from all over. They were from the mid-Atlantic oftentimes. I mentioned Nathaniel Gordon was from Maine. Baltimore was a shipbuilding center that produced a lot of ships that were sleek and fast and can elude capture. And it changes over time. I mean, in the 1850s, for example, there was a glut of shipbuilding for people interested in going to California for the gold rush. By the mid-1850s, there was this glut of really sleek, fast ships that were built to go around the Cape of Good Hope and up to California, and they don't have anybody to buy them. And so some people snatched up these ships, just merchants and they weren't necessarily all ne'er-do-wells. They were just kind of people who were willing to take a bit of a risk and get involved in this. They saw opportunities for quick profits. I should point out that there were probably, we don't know exactly how many people were smuggled into the United States. Probably somewhere around 30 to 60,000 people between 1808 and the 1860s actually were smuggled in after that ban went into effect. Much of the slave trade focused on Brazil and Cuba. So the Americans who got involved oftentimes were involved in those trades. So, yes?
How many slaves or ex-slaves were actually sent to Liberia, and how did they manage to set up a country government?
It was difficult. There were about 15,000 people who were freed in the United States, and another 5,000 to 10,000 who were freed from slave vessels who were settled in Liberia. They had some support from that American Colonization Society to get established farms, but they were from the beginning they were dealing with the native population of that part of Africa who weren't necessarily happy that they were there, and so there was every couple of years there were these border wars. And so that was one of the things that forged a bond between the Americo-Liberians and those recaptives, as they were kind of settled in this community and they were surrounded by different kingdoms and ethnic groups that didn't necessarily want them there. And so it was quite difficult. It wasn't particularly arable land. And so, Liberia to this day has been beset by many problems. And of course, Liberia has been dealing with the Ebola pandemic as well. But has always struggled as a nation state. Sure.
When they sent these people back, they were from a variety of different cultures.
Right.
I would think that would have created plenty of marketplace.
Yes, there were many different problems, and in fact, in my research, I found an example of a slave ship that had only 8 people on board. It was involved in the Cuba to the Gulf Coast trade. It was a slave trader went down to Cuba, took on a cargo of about 8 people, and was going to try to smuggle them to a plantation in West Florida. And when they were detained by the U.S. Marshal, there were people in Florida who recognized them as foreign-born. They didn't like the idea of foreign-born blacks being settled in Florida. They thought they would unsettle the slave population and foment revolt. And so they ratted them out. But interestingly, in the court depositions in that case, it said exactly what you were pointing out, which was that these were individuals who didn't speak to one another. They didn't seem to like one another. They were from different ethnic groups that were historical enemies. And so, yes, it was very difficult to find any type of national unity in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Yes.
But that little diagram you showed with the slaves packed together in the boat, was that a bit of an effective piece of propaganda?
It was very effective. It was, historians have debated how typical that scenario really was.
If it was effective, I wonder if you could produce something like that about airline seats. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, being 6'3", I can sympathize. But yes.
Where did the supply of slaves in Africa, how did that come about? That these traders could just, come into Africa, load up their boats, and take off. How did that evolve?
It evolved, a very good question. This situation had been evolving really for hundreds of years. And there had been different slave trades, different versions of slavery. The institution of slavery had been around for thousands of years. The Atlantic slave trade was by far the most organized and systematic of any slave trade in history. And so there definitely were African kingdoms that were involved in the slave trade and were in selling people who were prisoners of war from ongoing conflicts within Africa. But as the clear demand for slaves was evident over time, particularly by the 18th century, there was more concerted efforts to go on slave raiding missions to capture people like Ulude Equiano and Phyllis Wheatley as children and take them into slavery. Yeah, and then they would have certain areas on the west coast of Africa that were known, sometimes known as factories, where people would be detained and held for slave traders to come and purchase them and then pack them into ships and take them to the Americas. Yes?
Can you comment on the scope of the North American slave trade in terms of the tool transatlantic slave trade?
Yeah, in terms of the history of the Atlantic slave trade, North America was sort of a minority of the overall people who were coming across in the Atlantic slave. That's what you're getting at. Most people were brought to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean or to plantations in Brazil. So there were far more people who were taken to slavery in other parts of the New World. American slavery continued to expand over the course of this period, largely through not so much continued importations, but natural reproduction. So the slave population had grown to about 4 million in the United States by the 1860s.
One more question.
Yeah, Julie.
Why did the colonization of Sierra Leone and Liberia end?
Very shortly after they were established, they were pretty much granted autonomy. And the United States and Great Britain both remained involved in establishing aid societies there. But well into the 20th century and into the 21st century, the United States has remained involved in the Liberian economy. In the 21st century, for example, Liberia was a very important producer of rubber, and there was a Firestone plant in Liberia and produced a lot of rubber for the war effort for the Allies in World War II. But a lot of the wealth produced from those rubber plantations, went to the Firestone Corporation, and so really left Liberia still quite destitute. So the United States is not really heavily involved politically, but more maybe a neo-imperialistic role in the 20th century. Sure.
I want to take this time to invite those of you who wish to speak with Dr. Willis after the presentation to take that opportunity. But I think you'll agree with me that this is an absolutely fascinating topic that we don't know enough about. And we have this expertise right here at Stevens Point. And it's just pretty spectacular every time I discover that we have these kinds of scholars with us. I know they're here, but when I hear more about what they study, it just blows me away. We have a true resource here, and I want to thank Dr. Lee Willis for a spectacular talk.
Thanks for coming.